Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Unraveling Politics, this very special episode where we are going to be talking about a fascinating topic, in my opinion, the fall of democracy in Venezuela. So, why should we care about this? Well, the fall of democracy tends to happen in similar ways across the world. Rarely in the 21st century and in the late 20th century do democracies get overthrown by military coup. That's a misconception that there's a government and then the military comes in, overthrows it, and then either a dictatorship or a democracy is installed. That doesn't really happen very much. It does happen, for example, happened in Chile in 1973 when our government, the American government, helped overthrow the democratically elected left-wing leader Salvador Allende. Pretty horrible in my opinion. That's a story for another time. We're going to focus on Venezuela, where they were, where they are at now, and where they may be in the coming years. So we'll start in the late 1970s and the 80s. You could go all the way back to colonial period where they were Spain, and then they became Gran Colombia, part of Gran Colombia, and their leader Simón Bolivar. We're not going to get that far back. We're going to start in the 1970s and 80s, where Venezuela was one of the richest countries in South America. Now it is one of the poorest. So what happened? That's the story I'm going to explain. So buckle up. It's quite fascinating. So Venezuela's main export has always been oil. And if you're familiar with oil, usually countries that have oil as their largest exports tend to be dictatorships. Not always. For example, America is not a dictatorship and we export quite a lot of oil. I don't know if it's our number one export, but it's certainly high up there. Usually, as I said, these countries tend to be dictatorships. Think like Saudi Arabia today or Saddam Hussein in Iraq in the 2000s. In Venezuela, oil is not just the largest export, it is basically the only export. Upwards of 90% of the country's export is oil, which leaves the country very vulnerable to oil price shocks, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. The oil industry is not only a private-run industry like it is in the US. If you've heard me say over the show, if you've been a long-time listener, you'll hear I will say we don't have a state-run oil industry in this country. Venezuela does. It's a company called Petróleos de Venezuela, or PDVSA. So see the problem here? The only export is state-run that's begging for corruption to come knocking. So anyway, there was a reliance on oil. There was no need because oil was very profitable in the 70s and 80s and 90s and early 2000s. There was really no need to industrialize or do anything else. Since oil prices, as I said, were high in the 70s and 80s, corruption began to rise. At this time, Venezuela was one of the richest countries on earth and was still a very strong democracy. Then we had the rise of Hugo Chavez, which in many ways is like the rise of Trump here in America, and I'll let you decide that in the moments ahead. In 1989, there was a left-wing military insurgency, usually coups are right-wing military insurgency, so it was a left-wing one this time. And then there was another coup in 1992, both of which I believe were led by Hugo Chavez, definitely the second one. With the advice of Fidel Castro in Cuba, Chavez decided to run for the presidency rather than overthrow it. When Chavez ran in 1998, he ran against the 40 years of elite power and promised a social and political revolution. So sound familiar? And in 1998, he won. In the late 90s and early 2000s, across Latin America, there was a wave of left-wing leaders that got elected. So you think the Kirchners in Argentina, you had Chavez in Venezuela, of course Castro in Cuba was still there, you had Lula da Silva in Brazil, so you had a lot of left-wing leaders come to power around the same time. So Chavez's revolution was called the Bolivarian Revolution, after, as I mentioned earlier, Simón Bolivar, a revolutionary in Latin America, who helped lead the independence of Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela. So in 1999, Chavez took power, I believe it was in February 1999. In his inauguration address, he declared, "I swear to push through the necessary democratic reforms." And if you follow politics long enough, you'll start to notice that things are quite often the opposite of what they seem. The People's Republic of China, for example, is not for the people and it's not a republic. Same thing with like the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's not democratic, it's not a republic. So Chavez immediately moved to change the constitution in his first year in office, and resistance was basically non-existent. So he was creating what we in political science call a delegative democracy, with himself at the center. A delegative democracy is a type of democracy where it's basically a dictatorship, but there is still elections. The idea is that whoever wins the election can run the country however they see fit. So it sounds similar to Trump's rhetoric. In countries like the United Kingdom, Canada, the US, and Germany, it's not an exhaustive list, there is an emphasis on protecting minority rights, and you do not see that in delegated democracies. And by the way, when we say minority rights, we don't necessarily mean rights of like race minorities or ethnic minorities or religious minorities. We're talking about any kind of group that might be in the minority. For example, rich people would be considered in the minority, or it might be, or it could be, as I said, some kind of religious group. They're not necessarily racial. I think in America, when we think minority, we always think like racial minority. So in Venezuela, there was a very majoritarian view of democracy, which is basically like people who believe like what the majority says goes, and if you're not in the majority, then too bad. The elections themselves were usually very personality based and emotional affairs. Also, does that sound familiar? There were very few checks and balances, which leaves these kind of countries vulnerable to breakdown, which is exactly what happened, as I will explain in the future in a little bit. Chavez ruled without democratic oversight, and Congress was in his party the entire time he was in office. That changed later, as I'm going to explain when the next president takes over, but you'll see what happens there is quite shocking. In April 2002, which is about 3 years into his presidency, Chavez was overthrown by a military coup. So in a democracy, you need to have a loyal opposition. That's why in parliamentary systems, the leader of the opposition is called the leader of His Majesty's loyal opposition. Loyal meaning they accept that they're not in power, they will work with the president or prime minister through democracy. So Chavez's opposition turned from loyal to disloyal. And when you have a disloyal opposition, that basically means they're trying to overthrow you, which they did for 3 days, and an interim president was installed, but public backlash was so strong he was brought back to power. So Chavez faced a recall from office in 2004, and the government leaked the people who signed the petition, which left them subject to harassment and abuse. Meanwhile, the price of oil and globally was very, very high. Chavez spent his money as he wanted to, mostly to fund education, healthcare, and food subsidies. To his credit, poverty did fall by more than half. What people didn't see back then was he was hollowing out the economy. Government deficits grew larger and larger in order to keep poor people happy, which was his political base. And in 2006, he won re-election easily. The election was free and fair. By the way, and when I say free and fair, free means that people were free to vote how they wanted, and fair meaning the government didn't put their thumb on the scale. Basically, that's what that means. So Chavez tried to push through amendments to the Constitution in 2007 to change it to allow him to keep running for office, and they were narrowly defeated. Unlike the Soviet Union in the 20th century and Cuba today and back then, there was still some sort of democratic opposition. They weren't very strong, but there was a democratic opposition against Chavez. They were just toward the end they were being repressed. Usually, in a country with a history of democracy, they tend to have that spirit stay within the people, even if it's underground. So, if we ever fell into dictatorship here in America, I would think it would be more like Venezuela than it would be Russia, which has a history of no democracy. So Chavez did accept the results of the 2007 referendum. However, he tried again in 2009, and they were passed. And what I think was really insidious of these referendums, and if you're super interested, I recommend you look into it. The referendum allowed him to run again, but it also stuck other things that would appeal to his base in there. So it would have been like paid time off or raising the minimum wage. That kind of stuff was stuck in there to try to get people to vote for it. The government thumb was definitely pressed on the scale here. So the government, it was free and fair. Both of these referendums were considered free and fair, but the government strongly pushed voters to pass them. So Chavez was allowed to run for re-election forever. He said he was going to plan to stay in office until 2021. He ran again in 2012 as he was getting cancer treatment, and that election was not free or fair. The media was repressed by the government, and the Chavez administration withdrew the license of media organizations and repressed democratic opposition voices. He won again somewhat easily, mostly for the reasons I explained, and then he died in 2013. So that's the end of Chavez. Freedom House, which tracks human rights and the status of democracy around the world, reported in 2010, quote, Venezuela is not an electoral democracy. While the act of voting is relatively free and the count is fair, the political opposition is forced to operate in extremely difficult circumstances, and the separation of powers is nearly non-existent. And that's not true today, but that was true back then. Even though Chavez was repressing dissent and held strong powers, he still went to the people for his support, which is why it wasn't a complete dictatorship like North Korea. So when Chavez died, he was replaced by his vice president, Nicolas Maduro, who is still in office today. He promised to continue the Bolivarian revolution, and he's not charismatic in any way whatsoever. He's completely uninspiring. So those enormous deficits that were piling up were unstable, and the trigger was the oil price collapse of 2014. And when prices of oil collapsed, there was not any money to pay for all the social programs. So the government had two choices. They could either pull the plug on the social programs or they could turn on the money printer. And if you're familiar with Venezuela, you will know which one they did. They turned on the money printer, and which led to exactly what you expected: international isolation, hyperinflation, and an economy that is in the toilet. U.S. sanctions have largely halted Venezuelan exports of oil, so they have had to sell their oil at a deep discount on top of all that. And then, meanwhile, the Venezuelan bolivar is basically worthless. It's worth less than the paper it's printed on. Imagine that. In 2015, the opposition won control of the legislature for the first time in 16 years, and that was since Chavez came to power. Maduro stripped the legislature of its power. After he forced some opposition judges into the courts out and stripped the legislature of its powers. He made a new legislative body and called for new elections to try to rewrite the Constitution and remove every check and balance that was still left. And then that obviously worked. Since there was very little dissent in the government, you had two groups. Since you had very little dissent within the government, because now the government was all on Maduro's side, you had two groups. You had the government itself, and then you had armed rebellions on the other. And so that has the potential for extreme violence. The new assembly, the National Constituent Assembly, the people did not get a vote on whether it should exist at all, only the membership of it. So last year in 2024, Maduro won again, except there's not a snowball's chance in hell he won legitimately. There were very few independent observers on polling day to make sure the election was fair, and what's scary is that he said if he lost the election, there would be a civil war and his party would win by hook or by crook. So in the summer of 2024, after he quote-unquote won, it looked like pressure from the international community was building to remove him, but it went nowhere. In fact, it seems that Maduro is stronger than ever. Unlike Maduro, Chavez never had to use the military or security forces against ordinary citizens. His pressure was more within the system. It was covert, not overt. So as you can see, I've been highly critical so far. There's a lot to criticize, as you can imagine. And there's one thing I will compliment Chavez on, and I think our political leaders will be wise to pick up for, is that in his 14 years in power, the poor felt seen for the first time in a long time. Even now, after all that's happened, they still look back at his time in office very fondly. Al Jazeera reported in 2013, a man said, "President Chavez gave us so much, he trusted us, the people, and we trusted him." Many people believe Chavez would have done better than Maduro in the years since. I don't think that's true, but of course, that's up to speculation. Chavez commanded the strong respect of many Venezuelans, and that's for him as a politician to have been very proud of, even if he was probably the second worst president that the country ever had. So what are some lessons to learn here? Why did I go through this story? Well, it shows that democracy does fall, even in the richest countries. It shows that democracy must be protected and guarded, much like Biden said when he was in office. However, Biden also undermined democracy by attacking courts when they made a decision he disagreed with, but that's a point for another time. Checks and balances are important, and when they are removed, very bad things can happen, as you can see in Venezuela. So what about socialism in general? Well, I think this is one of the many cases of socialism failing. It showed that when you depend your economy on one thing, it leaves yourself very vulnerable to shocks, especially oil prices. Ideally, an economy would be diversified in services and commodities. Commodities being like things, like that would be like oil or wheat or corn or whatever. Also, state controls without inefficiency leads to decline. So the state-run oil company became more corrupt as the years went by, and socialism tends not to implement these checks and accountability. Additionally, socialism is also about redistribution of wealth. You can't redistribute if there is no production. Once oil prices fell, there wasn't much of a private sector to fall back on, which was a huge problem. Not to mention, the private sector also fled the country in droves because of how unstable it was toward the end. I think most importantly, short-term populism undermines long-term stability, and if you're into politics, you already know where I'm going. If not, you'll see where I am in a moment. Social welfare gains via programs need long-term planning and productivity growth to endure. When you try to set up social welfare programs such as a Green New Deal or Medicare for All, or conversely, if you try to have massive tax cuts without costing them, that erodes stability by piling up debt. Lastly, pay attention when you see an American president trying to do what Chavez did. The elephant in the room is Trump. Well, I think Trump and Chavez, and I would argue figures like Bernie Sanders, are cut from the same political cloth. They may not always be on the same side of the spectrum, but they tend to represent the anger with the system and the danger that anger can lead to. And usually they always have someone to blame. With Trump, it's immigrants, and with Bernie Sanders and Chavez, it was rich people. But usually populists in common, left or right, they will blame the system. There are some vague signs here that we could be heading toward a Venezuelan-style government, but I don't believe it's what the left has feared, and I'll leave that up for you to judge. And as always, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this special episode. If you like these kind of little mini case studies in the future, if you want to hear more about them, please let me know. Give it a like and subscribe, and I will talk to you next week. Bye bye.